Hi, my name is Paul Mazurek. I'm the Maritime Museum Curator of the City of Eyre, and I'm also a Tourism Assets Development Officer. Um, this presentation is part of the celebrations of South Australian History Month of May 2023. I prepared a presentation about the early exploration of the Northeast Peninsula, which is the landscape you see behind me. However, this ancient landscape was created millions and millions of years ago, and it was inhabited by the first people approximately about 40,000 years ago. It took to the first Europeans to arrive here in the early 1800s. It wasn't just discovery for the South Australian continent, but it was also a discovery which was the last piece of the puzzle about the discovery of the whole Australia. Early European exploration of Northeast Eyre Peninsula 1802-1901. This exploration happened in two ways. The first one and the early one started over the sea as a maritime event, and basically from 1802 to 1901. The second land exploration was a bit later, so all terrestrial explorations happened only after 1830-09, but also finishing in 1901 for the purpose of this research and presentation. Introduction. In the late 18th century, the southern section of Terra Australis in what is now South Australia remained a mystery to European explorers. The first expedition to chart the then unknown coast between Ceduna and Victor Harbour was conducted by Matthew Flinders in 1802. The maritime goal of the period was achieved. However, it took almost a further 40 years to start the proper land exploration north of Adelaide. The pastoral settlement took even longer, especially in the Northeast Eyre Peninsula region. This area, Northeast Eyre Peninsula, is defined by the western shores of Spencer Gulf in the east, Gawler Ranges in the north, and Middleback Range area in the west. So topic 1 is the exploration by the sea. 1802. The very first Europeans to sail the waters of the northern Spencer Gulf were Matthew Flinders and his crew aboard HMS Investigator. The English, Scottish, and Austrian nationalities were represented. In an order issued by the Commissioner for executing the office of Lord High Admiral, Flinders received, among others, one specific task, quote, "You are to make the best of your way to the coast of New Holland, running down the said coast from 130 degrees of east longitude to Bass Strait. And on your arrival on the coast, use your best endeavors to discover such harbors as may be in those parts, and in case you should discover any creek or opening likely to lead to an inland sea or strait, you are at liberty either to examine it or not, as you shall judge it most expedient, until a more favorable opportunity shall enable you so to do." The end of the quote. At that time, it was still considered a possibility that the Australian continent may be divided by an inland sea. Therefore, Matthew Flinders' hopes were probably high when he entered what is now Spencer Gulf and continued sailing north. After leaving Sir Joseph Banks' group of islands north of Port Lincoln, they entered the northern section of the Gulf on Monday, March 8, 1802. Flinders first noted the remarkable landmarks of Middleback Ranges and Mount Young. Shortly after noon, however, the chance of a continuation of the Gulf into some open water was quickly terminated by a discovery of Point Lowly. Matthew Flinders wrote, quote, "Our prospect of a channel or strait, cutting off some considerable portion of Terra Australis, was lost, for it now appeared that the ship was entered into a gulf. but the width of the opening round Point Lowly left us a consolatory hope that it would terminate in river of some importance. The end of the quote. As it happened, this would not eventuate at all. Flinders anchored his ship close to the head of the Gulf, and while sending a survey party with botanist Brown to the highest peak of the rugged ranges on the east end, he continued on a boat beyond today's Port Augusta city, only finding a gulf ending in the desert. This led to his quick survey of the eastern shore of the Gulf and leaving the northern part of the Gulf. Flinders' vessel HMS Investigator has the reputation of being the first ship to sail the area and possibly the first vessel of any kind to be there at all. Built in 1795 as a collier Xenophon, the ship was later purchased by Royal Navy and renamed Investigator in 1801. After completing Flinders' Australian voyages, the Investigator was moored at Port Jackson as a store ship. After repairs and some colonial service, HMS Investigator was sailed back to England. 5 years later, she was sold to private contract, returned to merchant service in 1813, and renamed Xenophon again. After an incredible 77 years of service, the ship was finally broken up in 1872. William Westell, the official artist of the Flinders expedition, drew the very first European image of the northeast Eyre Peninsula landscape as viewed from Mount Brown at the same time. 1803. 10 months later, on Thursday, January 21, 1803, the French navigator Louis-Claude de Saulles de Freycinet, on board the schooner Casuarina, entered the northern Spencer Gulf. Acting on the orders of Nicolas Baudin, he sailed along the eastern shore of the Gulf to complete the navigation of the Gulf, of which Baudin himself was unable to complete in April 1802. After reaching approximately the same anchorage as Flinders at the head of the Gulf, he turned south and continued the exploration of the western shore. Strong summer southerly winds and unknown waters caused him to tackle severely, which resulted in 2 long days of sailing the distance between Port Augusta and Point Lowly. Freycinet wrote, quote, "After escaping with skill as much as good fortune from this continuous peril of the last part of their voyage, M.L. Freycinet identified in succession Cape La Fontaine, which is Point Douglas, Corney Bay, which is Fitzgerald Bay, Cape Moliere, which is Point Lowly, and spent the night of January 24 opposite a third bay, which is False Bay, the entrance of which appears to him absolutely inaccessible because of the sandbanks blocking it fully." The end of the quote. Freycinet considered the landscape in the Whyalla area attractive and regretted that he didn't have time to send landing parties and explore the interior. The French expedition then left the northern Spencer Gulf, which they called Golfe de Bonaparte, on Tuesday, January 25, 1803. Freycinet's Australian-built ship Le Casuarina was a 12-meter schooner with 2 masts. The ship was constructed in Port Jackson in 1802 and purchased by Baudin the same year. In 1803, La Casuarina was paid off at the island of Mauritius. The name came from the timber used in hair construction in Sydney. 1830. The waters of northern Spencer Gulf were not sailed or visited by Europeans for another 27 years. In March 1830, Captain John Nicholson, on colonial cutter Dart from Sydney, approached the head of the Gulf in attempt to find any traces of Captain Sturt's expedition. The ship anchored above Curlew Point, southwest of Port Augusta. 1840. 10 years later, in July 1840, Captain William Pullen on cutter Waterwitch delivered stores and equipment for Edward John Eyre expedition and landed at the head of the Gulf. The Waterwitch was built in Hobart in 1834. The ship arrived in South Australia in 1838, a year later purchased by the South Australian government, and she sank in the Murray River near Blanchetown in 1842. 1852. Captain Edward Dowsett with Messieurs Alexander Lang and John Granger on board ship Yatala landed at the head of Spencer Gulf and proclaimed the city of Port Augusta. 1854. Schooners Daphne and Bandicoot shipped the first wool from Port Augusta to Port Adelaide. The Daphne was built in Bombay, India in 1849, and she was registered in Port Adelaide in 1850 and later sold to Melbourne approximately 18 years later. The Bandicoot was constructed in Hobart in 1838 and registered in Port Adelaide in 1852. The ship was eventually wrecked at Port Macdonald in 1861. 1857. Steamship Marion started operating from Port Adelaide to Franklin Harbour and Port Augusta. Steamship Marion was built in Glasgow in 1854. She was wrecked at the bottom of York Peninsula in 1862. 1859. The first ships arrived in Port Augusta to load cargo destined directly for England. No details of the vessels have been confirmed. 1861. Since 1861, another steamship Lubra joined SS Marion in regular service to Spencer Gulf on routes to Wallaroo and Port Augusta. SS Lubra was built in Scotland in 1860 and arrived in Port Adelaide in 1861. She was wrecked in Jurien Bay, Western Australia in 1898. 1862. In 1862, SS Lubra sailed to Port Augusta every Saturday. In the same year, the Scottish ship O'Malley landed the first direct cargo from England to Port Augusta. O'Malley first visited South Australia in 1854, bringing migrants to Port Adelaide. In 1862, Alfred Charles Weblink of the Marine Survey Department of South Australia on board of HMS Beatrice resurveyed the coast north of Point Lowley to Port Augusta and prepared a detailed official report. In his nautical description of Port Augusta in 1862, he provided an excellent account of the early days of shipping in Spencer Gulf. Quote, "It has been custom hitherto for vessels bound for Port Augusta to proceed first to Port Adelaide and there pick up a pilot for Spencer Gulf and Port Augusta. The outward bound vessels frequently leave their pilots at Wedge Island at the mouth of Spencer Gulf. Tugs can be procured from Port Adelaide, to which place a mail goes overland once a week. The steamer trading to Port Augusta frequently tows vessels up or down through the estuary on her trips backwards and forwards." The end of the quote. Schooner Beatrice was built in Sussex, England in 1860. She first came to Portland and then to Port Adelaide to serve Admiralty and South Australia as a survey ship in South Australian and Northern Territory waters. She was wrecked in 1897, salvaged and transferred to Melbourne, then wrecked a second time at Waterhouse Island, Bass Strait near Tasmania. 1883. The initial recommendation about the erection of a lighthouse at Point Lowley was made in 1878. The lighthouse and two cottages were then completed in 1883, with its first light shown on the 1st February 1883. The lighthouse is located at 32 degrees 50 minutes south and 137 degrees 48 minutes east. Today's height is 22.8 meters. The light's range reached 26 nautical miles. The construction proved to be difficult as all material had to be transported either by sea from Port Pirie or by rough coastal road from Port Augusta. The original lighthouse built was 15 meters high sandstone tower with optical apparatus made by Chance Brothers from Birmingham in England. After several accidents north of Point Lowry, the tower was extended to today's height, and the light range was eventually further extended in 1902. 1897. Cowlet's Landing, a partly sheltered bay at Nonowi Pastoral Leas, south of Hammock Hill, was established by the first settler at Nonowi, Mr. Cowlet, who lived between 1842 and 1935, for landing of small ships. He selected this bay and cleared a section of mangroves for this purpose. The ketches then delivered goods and equipment to the settlers and mining enterprises in the area. 1901. The construction of the first BHP Limited iron ore jetty started under Hammock Hill, the site of the future settlement of Whyalla. Topic 2 is the exploration by land between 1836 and 1901. 1836. The colony of South Australia was officially established. Northeast Eyre Peninsula at that time remained totally unexplored. 1839. Edward John Eyre, on his expedition from Streaky Bay to the head of Spencer Gulf, traversed the northern part of the Northeast Eyre Peninsula just below the ranges, which he named the Gawler Ranges. Edward John Eyre described his adventure in excursion from Port Lincoln to Streaky Bay in these words, quote, "On the afternoon of the 8th September, we evacuated our depot and steered easterly through a barren and scrubby country, very low and level, with occasional heights and granite, in the clefts of which we usually found a little water deposited by the rains. At about longitude 135 degrees and 25 minutes east, we came to a singular mass of lofty ranges extending far to the northwards and to the eastward. These ranges were devoid of timber, of a barren appearance, and consisted of granite and porphyritic granite, but principally the latter. There were neither creeks nor springs emanating from them, and the land around to their very base was low, barren, and scrubby, the hills themselves being nearly overrun with the prickly grass. I took the liberty of distinguishing this very remarkable range with the name of His Excellency the Governor Gawler, as it constitutes the principal feature in this part of the country and exhibits a succession of lofty, rugged ranges, one behind the other, stretching through a vast extent of country and thus forming a striking and singular contrast to the low and level waste around. In this vicinity and among the hills, we met with several small saltwater lakes with salsolaceous plants growing around their margins, but we were entirely dependent on the deposits of water left by the rains among the rocks for our supply of fresh water. The supply was thus very precarious, being only procurable in small quantities at a time and frequently at very considerable intervals apart. And even this was evidently rapidly disappearing before the rays of a very hot sun, so that I feel assured, had we delayed even a few days longer at Streaky Bay, we never could have succeeded in forcing a passage across. During the whole of our course from Port Lincoln along the coast to Point Bell and across the interior to the head of Spencer Gulf, a distance of 600 miles through, I believe, an hitherto unexplored country, we never crossed a single creek, river, or chain of ponds, nor did we meet with any permanent water anywhere, with the exception of 3 solitary springs on the coast, to which the few natives we met with appear to resort when the water left by the rains further inland is dried up. 1840. Edward John Eyre travelled again from Mount Arden in Flinders Ranges to Port Lincoln through the northern and central section of the northeast Eyre Peninsula, this time from the east to the west. And he described his experience of Northeast Eyre Peninsula section in the Journal of Royal Geographical Society of London as such. The quote: "In crossing from Mount Arden towards Port Lincoln, we travelled generally through a low country, densely covered with brush, among which were scattered at considerable intervals a few small patches of grass, with here and there some rocky elevations. In the latter, we were usually able to procure water for ourselves and horses, until we arrived at the districts already explored, in traversing which we passed, to the northeast of Port Lincoln, some rich, well-watered valleys, bounded by a considerable extent of grassy hills, well adapted for sheep or cattle, arriving at Port Lincoln on the 23rd October. The end of the quote. 1842. The pastoralist Charles Christian Dutton and his company, Messrs. Graham, Cox, Haldane and Brown, who was a former Adelaide policeman, disappeared without a trace somewhere near present Whyalla, while attempting to drive 250 cattle from Port Lincoln to Adelaide. 1854. The first pastoral lease in the present Eyre Knob area, some 50 km northwest of Whyalla, was granted. 1857. Point Lowly Station was owned by James Chambers at this time, and other pastoral leases were established at Lincoln Gap and Wartaka. 1860. The western side of Spencer Gulf from Mount Laura on the south and to Yudnapina and Euro Bluff on the north and west through the Gawler Ranges was very little known in the early 60s. The country to the northwest beyond the northern boundaries of Euro Bluff, Yudnapina and Carriverloo and west of Lake Torrens was unoccupied. In 1860, Edward Sterling of Point Lowly Station liberated a few pairs of rabbits to breed for sporting purposes, and eventually in 1864 there were great numbers of them there. 1862. F.G. Morgan leased property southwest from Point Lowly. The southern boundary of the lease was Hammock Hill, covering parts of later Nonoe and Mount Laura leases. 1863. A pastoral lease was established at Pandura, originally named as Tang Hill. 1863. Manini Mine established by Bismuth and Copper Mining and Patent Smelting Company, Adelaide. 1864. Manini Block lease held by Henry Holroyd from Adelaide, a lawyer, as a first owner of the Manini Block lease. 1867. The Manini mine operations were suspended. 1887. A.J. Bryant secured the contract for excavating a 9,000 cubic yards reservoir on the Franklin Harbour track about 70 miles south of Port Augusta and about 5 miles distant from the Manini mine. 1888. Mr. William Jones, a prospector from Broken Hill, was the very first applicant for a mining lease south of Corunna Station. 1891. A total of 34 applications were made to mine iron ore south of Corunna Station. 1899. BHP Limited acquired its first lease permit issued by the SA government to work ore deposits. 1901. The first permanent Whyalla settlements started in 1901 when 24 workers landed on the beach below Hammock Hill and began construction of the iron ore jetty while living in tents. The BHP tramway. At that time, privately constructed railways could not be named as railways, therefore the term tramway applies here. Between iron ore mine and Whyalla, which was then known as Hammock Hill, was opened in 1901. Mr. Charles J. Patterson was a 56-year-old settler at Maniaru next to Menini, and like many others in this area tried to start a settlement. However, a part of the diary from will describe how this was absolutely difficult. Quote, Wilpena, the ship, got out this morning. Mem, wife, has gone away with the Wilpena. Feel very lonely. Wagon gone for water. The place feels like someone was dead. Feel like I could sit down and cry. Strong north wind, very disagreeable, blowing very strong. Feel very anxious about the Wilpena. Wish I had not let her go. Hope they got across right. Spencer Gulf. Charles J. Patterson eventually left the lease in 1907 without succeeding. So in summary, the exploration and settlement of Northeast Eyre Peninsula proved to be very complicated. From the unfavorable winds, differences in depth and limited landing opportunities in the northern Spencer Gulf waters to the hostile semi-arid interior with no considerable water resources and distances. These were some of the major conditions that caused the delay, abandonment, and hesitancy to progress in the 19th century exploration and settlement. Thank you. I can be contacted for any inquiries at the numbers provided.